Welcome to Pride Partners International's monthly webinar. Thank you for joining us today. Pride Partners International is a global partnership of firms and specialists in transfer pricing and financial valuation. The association is the meeting ground for professionals capable of facing a challenging business environment, helping them connect to boost their continuous professional development and enhance their technical and human skills and abilities. This partnership is made up of experts recognized by their trajectory and prestige in the transfer pricing and financial valuation fields. Experts that constantly participate in the exchange of technical information, knowledge development, and implementation of global best practices. When a firm joins the PPI partnership, it increases its scope immediately and exponentially. Business becomes much simpler by accessing training, technology, resource optimization, and new business opportunities, among other benefits. We invite you to learn more about Pride Partners International. Contact our agents and be part of the global elite of transfer pricing and financial valuation consulting. Our transmission will begin shortly. We invite you to participate actively by sending all your questions or comments through the live chat. Again, thank you for watching, and we hope you enjoy the event.
Hi everybody, I'm Mark Loveday. I'm a partner in our firm Transfer Pricing and Tax Solutions. We specialise in New Zealand and Australian transfer pricing and international tax, as well as doing some New Zealand corporate tax advisory work. So our topic today is transfer pricing down under, which obviously refers to Australia and New Zealand as the rest of the world knows us. I thought it would be good just to start with a bit of an overview of our countries. Now, New Zealand and Australia are actually closest of allies, but they're also the fiercest of competitors in areas like the sporting field. New Zealand's got 5 million people, and it's got as many dairy cows as it does people. Australia's got 5 times more people than New Zealand, but it's got as many beef cattle as it does people. Now, the land areas might surprise you. New Zealand's actually larger than the UK, about the same size as Japan. And I'll show you shortly on the next slide how New Zealand land area compares when it's superimposed across Europe. But Australia is definitely a huge country. Its land area is about the same as continental USA. Both countries have export-led economies. New Zealand's driven by its dairy products, wood, meat, various horticulture like kiwi fruit and wine, as well as tourism. Australia tends to dig most of its commodities out of the ground, so its main exports are iron ore and coal. We both share China as our largest export markets. New Zealand relies on Australia as one of its largest export markets, and it's not so much the other way around. Now you see on the slide there that Australia's got much higher GDP per capita and higher average wages than does New Zealand. It's also got a higher corporate tax rate at 30% versus New Zealand's 28%. When it comes to transfer pricing, both countries can probably be said to be fairly sophisticated or mature. And it's fair to say that the Australian tax authorities are probably a bit more aggressive than the New Zealand authorities, particularly when it comes to some of the historic positions demanded on disputes or even on some APAs. As I mentioned, if you superimpose New Zealand across Europe in terms of land area, it would actually cross a lot of the countries in Europe. And while it hasn't got many people, it is actually a fairly large land area. So just like the flags of Australia and New Zealand on the slide, you can see they're very similar. So are the transfer pricing regimes of the countries. Both have incorporated the OECD guidelines into their legislation as an interpretive aid. Australia reformed its transfer pricing regime well before the BEPS reforms, and it's also had quite a few high value transfer pricing court cases that have tended to drive that reform. New Zealand's got some fairly unique rules on the pricing of loans, which I'm going to touch on a little later. In Australia, there are annual transfer pricing disclosures required as part of the tax return process, but New Zealand's got no disclosure at all for transfer pricing transactions and documentation. But that said, the tax authority does run ongoing active risk review campaigns, which actually go down to quite a fairly low revenue level. Australia tends to offer more safe harbour relief around simplifications to documentation and alleviating the need for benchmarking than does New Zealand. New Zealand's got very few safe harbours. Generally, the Australian Tax Office, or the ATO as we know it, provide more and more detailed practice guidance on transfer pricing than does the New Zealand Inland Revenue. In New Zealand, there are no rulings or interpretation statements, but the IRD does put some useful comments on their website around transfer pricing. Both the Australian Tax Office and the IRD in New Zealand have well-established advanced pricing agreements, but the average time to complete a unilateral APA in Australia is around 2.5 years historically, and it has been going up steadily over the last 10 years. Generally in New Zealand, a unilateral APA can be completed within 6 months and often much sooner. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Australia's transfer pricing regime. And on the slide there, you'll see the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Sydney Opera House. Australia was well ahead of the OECD's BEPS actions 8 to 10. Around 2012, the Australian Tax Office became concerned because a couple of cases that had gone to court under the existing transfer pricing laws had shown that the laws weren't working as the ATO had intended. So it went about to substantially reform its transfer pricing legislation in 2013. And some of the key changes were to ensure that the economic substance was paramount when it comes to pricing. It gave the ATO the ability to recharacterize transactions where the form of the transaction was not aligned to the actual conduct of the parties. The OECD guidelines were specifically referenced into the law, and the transfer pricing law now made reference to arm's length conditions as opposed to arm's length pricing. As I mentioned, the ATO has a history of releasing quite detailed rulings, guidance notes, and more recently practice compliance guides or PCGs to help taxpayers understand the ATO position and also serve as a tool for taxpayers to conduct self-assessment. Now, one of these PCGs deals with 7 safe harbours or simplification measures that the ATO provide to simplify compliance, and those safe harbours can be for small taxpayers or certain distributors. Some of the service fees are covered, immaterial transactions, and small value loans. There are some mandatory filing requirements in Australia, particularly for large groups, and we'll cover off the documentation requirements a little bit later in the presentation. But all companies in Australia with an aggregate transactions over $2 million have to file an annual detailed international dealing schedule, and that has quite a bit of detail about the intercompany transactions. Country-by-country reporting in Australia is slightly peculiar. When Australia refers to a local file for country-by-country reporting entities, it refers to a particular XML file that is actually a large disclosure document rather than what we understand to be an OECD local file. And the traditional OECD local file in Australia is actually referred to as a Section 815B document. And that's got to be prepared to obtain a reasonably arguable position or RAP. and you need a RAP to take advantage of penalty relief. Finally, I would mention that neither Australia nor New Zealand adopted the authorised OECD approach for branches. They both treat a branch as if it's a separate entity, but they do not allow notional intra-entity transactions. Okay, turning now to New Zealand's transfer pricing regime. And the pictures on the slide there is firstly the winning rowing eights at the last Olympic Games, where previously New Zealand had only won a gold at the 1972 Olympic Games in the eights. And the other picture is of the America's Cup, where New Zealand's the holder of the equivalent to Formula One racing for yachts, the America's Cup. Okay, on to the transfer pricing. Now in 2018, following the finalisation of BEPS, New Zealand made its changes to its transfer pricing legislation. And the key changes were to align the OECD guidelines post-BEPS, align the legislation to those OECD guidelines, and also to make sure that the New Zealand legislation was closely aligned to the Australian transfer pricing rules because of the large amount of trade between the countries. The new laws put the onus on the taxpayer when it comes to transfer pricing disputes, and previous to that change, the onus was on the Inland Revenue, and it was the only area of tax law where the onus was actually on the Inland Revenue. It extended the statute bar period from 4 years to 7 years, and all other tax law is 4 years only. It brought in some special rules for inbound loans, which we're going to cover off. And these rules were all effective from the 2019 financial year onwards. As I mentioned before, there's no annual disclosure requirements around transfer pricing in New Zealand as compared to Australia. Instead, the New Zealand Revenue rely on a series of questionnaires which they send out to target taxpayers to collate information and do a risk review. And these tend to be sent out to larger taxpayers as a risk assessment tool. Although when I say larger taxpayers, it does go down to taxpayers of revenue of $30 million or more. And those questionnaires cover a variety of areas. So there's one specifically on transfer pricing, there's a royalty one, there's one to do with financing, and there's also an international tax questionnaire. Inland Revenue does have a useful website that summarises transfer pricing practice issues, but it doesn't have the detail that the Australian Tax Office provide through their various rulings. And of course, the commentary on the website can change without any notice being given. There are a few safe harbours in New Zealand, but not as many as there are in Australia. So we have a safe harbour for small distributors. There's one covering small inbound loans and one covering low value adding services, which is the same as the provided in the OECD guidance where they allow a 5% markup without any benchmarking. Okay, we're going to cover off the documentation requirements in New Zealand and Australia, and you'll see there the two pictures on the slide, the divergence of the landscapes in our countries. So transfer pricing documentation is not mandatory in either country, except for country-by-country reporting entities. But in both countries, contemporaneous documentation is important to be able to claim a reasonable position has been taken and therefore avoid potential penalties if a dispute were to go against the taxpayer. And the documentation has to be provided on request by the tax authority, but usually a reasonable time is given to produce that document. New Zealand follows the OECD guidance on documentation. Australia imposes its own documentation requirements that are needed to claim a reasonably arguable position, or RAP as it's known. In most cases, that's only going to need a minor adaptation of a document that's already been formatted as an OECD local file, but in some cases it's going to require quite a bit of rework to meet those Australian requirements. In terms of benchmarking, Australia prefers that you have Australian comparables where possible, but it can be quite hard finding sufficient Australian comparables, in which case you can go further afield. In New Zealand, it's even harder to find New Zealand comparables because it's just about impossible to get financial information on New Zealand private companies. Australian comparables are preferred in New Zealand, and if that comes up short, then you can look in the UK, the US, Europe, and probably least desirable is across Asia. Intercompany agreements that have been executed contemporaneously with the transaction are certainly expected and are usually requested in an audit or a dispute. Okay, I want to have a look at New Zealand's rules around inbound loans. Now, New Zealand's got thin capitalisation rules to restrict the amount of inbound debt, and that's based on broadly based anyway, on a debt to asset ratio. And it's also got transfer pricing restrictions on the pricing of that debt. So it's got the controls, thin cap controls over the volume of debt, and it's got some restrictions around the pricing of the allowable debt. Now, the way those transfer pricing restrictions work is that it designates that for high-risk borrowers, then the pricing has to be close to the parent company's cost of borrowing senior debt on an unsecured basis. And it applies to inbound loans over $10 million in aggregate. So what's a high-risk borrower? Well, that's defined as either a New Zealand borrower where their thin capitalisation percentage is over 40%, and bearing in mind that the safe harbour for thin cap is normally 60% in New Zealand. Or the other situation you can be high risk is if the lender has a corporate tax rate of 15% or less. Now, it could be that in the group there's no identifiable parent, and in that case, if you're a high-risk borrower, then the minimum credit rating you can use to evaluate the pricing of the debt is the lowest investment grade, which is BBB minus. The other factor in restrictions on pricing a loan are that you cannot take account of features of the loan which would typically lead to an increase in the interest rate. So, for example, you cannot take into account the fact that your related party loan may be subordinated to other third-party debt. And you cannot price the loan with a term longer than 5 years. So it can have a term longer than 5 years, but you just can't take that into account when you price it. So broadly, it's not possible to pump up the leverage of a New Zealand subsidiary and then use a weak standalone creditworthiness to have a high interest rate on that loan. The IRD has introduced some safe harbours for loans under $10 million. And what they allow is quite generously a 3.75% margin on top of an appropriate base rate. And you don't have to do any credit rating analysis or benchmarking. So that base rate might be, if your loan, for example, is in New Zealand dollars, it might be, and it's a fixed rate loan, then you might use the New Zealand swap rate as the base rate. Now turning to how Australia treats inbound loans and the rules it has in place. So like New Zealand, it's got robust thin capitalisation rules. Now in 2017, the Australian Tax Office put out a practical compliance guide around inbound loans. And it gives quite a bit of guidance around the risk assessment that it applies when it's looking at the pricing of interest rates on inbound loans. Now, as a general rule, what they're saying is that the risk increases as far as the Australian Tax Office is concerned. It's a higher risk if you're going to have an interest rate where the interest rate's higher than the parent company's cost of borrowing. And that PCG provides a detailed risk assessment matrix which takes into account scoring of various debt attributes of the loan and also various circumstances surrounding the borrowing. And just to give a small illustration of one of the examples that they give, say you had the Australian subsidiary borrowing at 3.16% from its parent, which was 62 basis points above the parent company's cost of debt, and it's borrowing from a Hong Kong related lender on an unsecured and unsubordinated basis. Now the ATO would rate that as moderate risk, not low risk. And that's for two main reasons. One is because the lender is based in Hong Kong, which has a 16.5% tax rate, which is much lower than the Australian corporate tax rate. And the other reason is why it's not low risk is because it's outside 50 basis points of the parent company cost of debt. So anything within 50 basis points would kind of indicate a lower risk, but this is just outside, so hence the risk goes up. Now, just announced in the Australian budget at the end of October, the thin capitalisation rules in Australia are going to change. So at the moment, they have a balance sheet driven thin capitalisation restriction like New Zealand, but that's going to change to an earnings basis. So interest will be restricted to 30% of EBITDA, which aligns to the OECD recommendations. And interestingly, New Zealand rejected that specific change. You will be able to continue using an arm's length debt test as you can at the moment, but only for third-party debt. Now, like New Zealand, the Australian Tax Office has a safe harbour for small value loans, but New Zealand's is 10 million, whereas Australia has a threshold for loans under 50 million to use that safe harbour, and the loan has to be denominated in Australian dollars. Now, under that safe harbour, the interest rate for an inbound loan cannot be more than 1.83%. That's the rate they've set for 2022, and it does change every year. So it's not very generous. It's a fairly low rate, and probably very low given how interest rates have been going up in recent times. Now, I do want to mention the landmark case in Australia of Chevron, which was an appeal decision handed down in 2017. Now, in that case, the court actually implied a parental guarantee into the loan arrangement and therefore held that the taxpayer didn't prove its case that the interest rate was not excessive. The facts were not very helpful for the taxpayer. And what happened was that the Australian company, which was a subsidiary of the US Chevron, had issued commercial paper into the US to fund a large Australian gas project. So the Australian companies had a US subsidiary which issued the commercial paper at 1.2% with a parental guarantee, and it was denominated in US dollars. Having got the funds from the public, the money was lent to the Australian company at 9% in Australian dollars with no security, no covenants, and no guarantee. But the rate, the 9% rate, was consistent with its standalone credit profile. Now, the court, when it had a look at all these circumstances, considered that no lender would have made that loan without seeking various security, loan covenants, and a parental guarantee. So arm's length conditions required a guarantee, and so the court implied one into the arrangement, and hence the 9% interest rate was considered well in excess of what it would be with a parental guarantee. Okay, we're going to wrap up the presentation just by looking at some of the focus areas of the tax authorities in the respective countries. And my pictures here of one, the national bird of New Zealand, the kiwi, and the national animal in Australia, the kangaroo. So in New Zealand, there's been lots of scrutiny and disputes of distributors of foreign-owned companies. And those disputes are focusing on the net margins and whether they are consistent given the functional profile of the company. In some cases, there's been disputes as to whether the New Zealand distributor is actually contributing to the marketing intangibles and should be sharing in some of the intangible related returns. There's been very similar disputes in Australia as well on distributors, and in some cases there's been simultaneous audits carried out in New Zealand and Australia on the same group of companies, with the tax authorities sharing some of their information that they collect. In Australia, the ATO has issued a practical compliance guide that gives some sort of guidance on acceptable arm's length ranges for distributors in some industries. And below that range, it would be considered high risk, and then above a certain level would be considered low risk. And on that slide, you can see that there are ranges there for general distributors, distributors in the life sciences, for the tech sector and the automotive sector. There's also been disputes in both countries on inbound financing. In New Zealand now, with the new rules, investigations are really centering on whether the new rules are being observed. In Australia, there's been some court cases on inbound financing, which has helped at least to clarify some of the rules. The area of intangibles is a recurring area of focus. The royalties will certainly be questioned when they're paid by companies that are making losses or insufficient profits. And the tax authorities expect analysis around DEMPI functions to demonstrate which parties are carrying out the DEMPI functions and bearing the relevant risks. Once again, the Australian Tax Office has published a practical compliance guide around their expectations for taxpayers to demonstrate that the intangible related returns are arm's length. And the other area in Australia which is often looked at are marketing hubs. So these are typically overseas subsidiaries, often set up in lower tax countries, which are set up to market commodities. And the issues there are whether there is substance in the hub and whether the return that is left in the hub is consistent with the value that's created in that country. So that wraps up our presentation. Thanks very much for us being invited to talk to you today. Our contact details are on the slide. Thank you.